September 22nd, 1941. Over the fields of Ukraine hung the shadow of a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. On this day, one of the most dramatic battles of the initial period of the Great Patriotic War concluded. The Kyiv defensive operation. What happened near Kyiv is rightly considered the largest encirclement in military history. 650,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves in the steel pincers of German tank divisions. The scale of this tragedy still astounds military historians and strategists. The Kyiv Cauldron became a turning point that almost led to the collapse of the entire Soviet defense on the Eastern Front. This was not merely a military operation, it was a clash of strategic concepts, personal ambitions, and fateful decisions. Why did Hitler decide to turn south instead of striking directly at Moscow? How did the Soviet command find itself unprepared for such a turn of events? What consequences did this disaster have for the further course of the war? In this story, military art and human tragedies, brilliant maneuvers and fatal miscalculations intertwine. The Barbarossa Plan, developed by the Wehrmacht High Command at the end of 1940, envisioned a lightning-fast defeat of the Soviet Union in 8 to 10 weeks. German strategists were confident. A decisive blow to the Red Army's border groupings would be enough, and the Colossus, with feet of clay, would crumble. Hitler declared to his generals, "We only need to kick in the door, and the whole edifice will collapse." The plan was based on an offensive along 3 strategic directions. Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal von Lieb, was to capture the Baltic states and Leningrad. Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock, aimed for Minsk, Smolensk, and then Moscow. Army Group South, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was tasked with occupying Ukraine and advancing towards Rostov-on-Don. Initially, the main thrust was directed at the central sector. It was here that the main tank forces of the Wehrmacht were concentrated. In the first weeks of the war, the German war machine operated like a flawlessly tuned mechanism. Tank wedges deeply cut into Soviet defenses, creating huge encirclement pockets. By mid-July, Minsk, Riga, Pskov, and Vitebsk had already been captured. German troops advanced 300 to 400 kilometers deep into Soviet territory. By early August, Army Group Center took Smolensk and was approximately 300 kilometers from Moscow. It seemed the original plan was working flawlessly. However, the pace of the offensive began to slow down. Soviet troops, despite enormous losses, offered increasingly fierce resistance. Stretched communications, supply problems, troop fatigue. All this forced the German command to consider adjusting its strategy. It was at this moment that the famous dilemma arose. Continue the offensive on Moscow, or temporarily halt it to destroy a large Soviet grouping in the south? By August 1941, a paradoxical situation had developed on the southwestern front. Despite the general retreat of the Red Army, a peculiar bulge formed near Kyiv, deeply embedded in German positions. More than 50 Soviet divisions were concentrated here. This bulge simultaneously represented both a threat and a temptation for the German command. By August of 41, the German command faced an extremely difficult strategic choice, which many historians would later call fateful for the entire Eastern campaign. The General Staff of the Army, led by Franz Halder, insisted on continuing the offensive in the Moscow direction. The logic of the military professionals was simple and clear. Moscow is the political, transport, and industrial center of the Soviet Union, the symbolic heart of the country. The capture of the Soviet capital, in their opinion, could lead to the collapse of the entire system of governance, and as a consequence, to the capitulation of the USSR. However, Adolf Hitler viewed the situation differently. The Führer was obsessed with the idea of destroying enemy manpower and seizing economic resources. In his eyes, the Kyiv salient presented an ideal opportunity to encircle and destroy a large grouping of Soviet troops. Moreover, Ukraine, with its rich agricultural lands, the industry of Donbass, and strategic position on the way to Caucasian oil, held immense economic significance for the Third Reich. Fierce debates erupted within the General Staff. Halder and the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock, insisted on continuing the offensive toward Moscow. They argued that Soviet troops near Kyiv posed no immediate threat and could be contained by smaller forces, while the main forces would continue their advance toward the main objective. Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, also advocated for the Moscow direction. In his memoirs, he would later write, "The turn to the south was a fatal mistake." But Hitler remained adamant. At a meeting on August 18th, he declared, "Before we go to Moscow, we must clear our right flank in Ukraine." The Führer's decision also had a rational basis. The enormous salient of Soviet troops indeed posed a potential threat to the stretched communications of Army Group Center. Furthermore, German intelligence reported the concentration of large Soviet reserves before Moscow. Hitler feared that an offensive on the capital could lead to protracted battles and the failure of the Blitzkrieg. Economic motives always played a key role in Hitler's decisions. For him, the war with the Soviet Union was not only an ideological crusade against Bolshevism, but also a struggle for living space, Lebensraum, a concept he elaborated on in his book Mein Kampf. Ukraine, with its fertile black soils, appeared to him as the true breadbasket of the future German Empire. In his speeches to the High Command, Hitler repeatedly emphasized, "We need Ukrainian bread, Donbass coal, and Caucasian oil. Without these resources, we cannot wage a long war against the Anglo-Saxons." World War II for the Third Reich was largely a war for resources. By the summer of 1941, the German war machine was already beginning to experience shortages of fuel and food. The blockade by the Western Allies cut Germany off from many sources of raw materials. In these circumstances, Ukraine's riches became critically important. Another significant factor influencing Hitler's decision was his deep distrust of professional military men. The Führer believed that generals thought too traditionally, too fixated on geographical objects like capitals. He, however, saw war differently, as a struggle to annihilate the enemy's manpower. In his view, the capture of territories made sense only after the defeat of the enemy's main forces. "Kyiv is not just a city," Hitler said at a meeting at the headquarters. "It is the key to controlling all of Ukraine and the path to the Caucasus. If we destroy the Soviet troop grouping near Kyiv, we will deprive Stalin of the ability to organize a defense in the southern direction." It is noteworthy that Hitler was supported in making this fateful decision by the Chief of the General Staff of the Army, Franz Halder, although he would later claim the opposite. In his diary on August 23, he wrote, "The Führer is right. The enemy's spatial thinking is incomprehensible to us. The Russians will not give up Kyiv easily. They will fight for it to the last man, which gives us a chance to destroy their forces in one great battle." While Hitler was making his fateful decision, an equally dramatic situation was unfolding in Moscow. At the Stavka of the Supreme High Command, two opposing views clashed regarding the fate of Kyiv and the troops of the Southwestern Front. Stalin categorically insisted on holding the Ukrainian capital at all costs. For him, this city had not only strategic, but also immense political significance. The loss of the cradle of Russian Orthodoxy, the mother of Russian cities, would deal a devastating blow to the morale of the entire country and the prestige of the Soviet leadership. Chief of the General Staff, Georgy Zhukov, and commander of the Southwestern Front, Mikhail Kirponos, saw the situation differently. Analyzing the rapid advance of German tank wedges, they understood that holding the Kyiv salient could lead to disaster. On July 29th, Zhukov presented Stalin with a plan to withdraw troops to the eastern bank of the Dnieper to avoid encirclement. The leader's reaction was immediate and sharp. "You propose surrendering Kyiv to the enemy. That will never happen." Stalin cut him off, slamming his fist on the table. Zhukov tried to explain that it was not about surrendering the city, but about saving hundreds of thousands of soldiers who could organize defense on new lines. But Stalin remained adamant. The meeting at the Stavka on August 18th became particularly dramatic. By this time, the threat of encirclement had become obvious even to members of the State Defense Committee who had no military education. Zhukov again presented a report, supported by intelligence data on the concentration of German tank formations on the flanks of the Kyiv salient. He directly stated that if the troops were not withdrawn immediately, a catastrophe would occur. After a heated discussion, Stalin asked, "Who is for abandoning Kyiv?" Zhukov and Shaposhnikov raised their hands. "Who is against?" Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, and Stalin himself voted to hold the city. Zhukov, unable to restrain himself, declared that in that case, he saw no possibility of continuing to serve as chief of the general staff. Stalin coldly replied, "You are free." The next day, Zhukov was removed from his post and sent to command the reserve front. His place was taken by the more pliable Shaposhnikov, who, although he shared Zhukov's concerns, did not dare to openly oppose Stalin. By the beginning of the Kiev operation, the balance of forces was not in favor of the Soviet troops. The Southwestern Front, under the command of Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos, numbered approximately 650,000 men, 5,000 guns and mortars, about 700 tanks, and 230 aircraft. However, many units were already battered in previous battles, experiencing shortages of ammunition and fuel. The opposing Wehrmacht forces represented a powerful fist. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's Army Group South included about 300,000 soldiers, 2,500 guns, 600 tanks, and 800 aircraft. From the north, a part of Army Group Center was advancing. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, numbering about 160,000 men, over 1,000 guns and 400 tanks. The qualitative superiority of the German troops was even more significant. The Wehrmacht's tank and motorized divisions possessed high mobility and well-practiced tactics of interaction. German PZ-3 and PZ-4 tanks, although inferior to Soviet T-34s and KV-1s in armor and firepower, had better optical instruments, radio communications, and more experienced crews. By this point, the Luftwaffe virtually completely dominated the air. Soviet aviation suffered heavy losses in the first weeks of the war and could not provide reliable cover for ground troops. This gave the Germans a decisive advantage in reconnaissance and the ability to inflict unpunished strikes on concentrations of Soviet troops and communications. The difference in the level of training of the command staff was particularly noticeable. German officers had the experience of victorious campaigns in Poland and Western Europe behind them. They acted proactively, made quick decisions, and effectively utilized the advantages of maneuver warfare. The Soviet command staff, on the contrary, was bled dry by the repressions of 37 to 38, and often showed indecisiveness, fearing personal responsibility for failures. The morale of the opposing sides also differed. German soldiers, inspired by previous victories, were confident in their superiority and the inevitable success of the entire campaign. In the Soviet troops, after a series of heavy defeats and retreats, there was a decline in morale, although the steadfastness and self-sacrifice of many units remained at a high level. The operational plan to encircle Soviet troops near Kyiv was the pinnacle of German military art in '41. Its development began in the last third of August, when Hitler finally approved the turn to the south. The concept of the operation was characterized by audacity and scope, unprecedented even by blitzkrieg standards. The main idea was to create gigantic pincers that were to close east of Kyiv, cutting off the entire grouping of the southwestern front from the main forces of the Red Army. The northern pincer was to be formed by Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, which struck from a bridgehead in the Gomel area in a southeastern direction. The southern pincer was formed by Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, advancing from the Kremenchug bridgehead to the north. Lukvitsa, a small town 200 kilometers east of Kyiv, was designated as the meeting point for the two tank groups. Infantry units of the 17th Army and the 6th Army were to pin down Soviet troops from the front, preventing them from retreating to the east. To ensure the success of the operation, the German command undertook an unprecedented maneuver. Guderian received orders to turn his tanks 90 degrees, from the Moscow direction to the Kyiv direction. Such a sharp turn of a large tank group during an offensive was a risky move, but the Germans were confident in their capabilities. The Luftwaffe aviation played a special role in the operation. The 2nd and 4th Air Fleets were tasked with blocking from the air all attempts by the Soviet command to transfer reinforcements to the encirclement area. German bombers were to continuously attack transport hubs, crossings over the Dnieper, and columns of Soviet troops. Fighters provided cover for tank wedges and suppressed the remnants of Soviet aviation. Wehrmacht tactical innovations included the widespread use of advanced groups, small mobile units consisting of motorcyclists, armored vehicles, and light tanks. These groups moved far ahead of the main forces, captured bridges, road junctions, and created panic in the rear of Soviet troops. They were followed by the main tank columns, which did not engage in protracted battles, but sought to advance as quickly as possible. Infantry and artillery were to destroy pockets of resistance left by the tanks. The Germans actively used radio communication for coordination. Each German tank was equipped with a radio station, which allowed commanders to quickly respond to changes in the situation. Soviet tanks, with the exception of command vehicles, did not have radio stations, which seriously hampered control in battle. Special attention was paid to logistics. To support the rapidly advancing tank wedges, special supply columns were created, delivering fuel, ammunition, and food. German engineering units were tasked with quickly restoring bridges and roads destroyed by retreating Soviet troops. The first tank divisions of the Wehrmacht began their movement on August 25, 1941. On this day, Guderian ordered his tank formations to turn south. The maneuver, which seemed adventurous to many German officers, began to be implemented. The 2nd Panzer Group, yesterday still aimed at Moscow, now rushed towards the Desna to cross it and continue moving in the direction of Konotop and Romny. Simultaneously, from the north, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group began its advance from the Kremenchug bridgehead. The German pincers began to move. The Soviet command did not immediately realize the scale of the threat. Stalin and the General Staff continued to believe that the main direction of the Wehrmacht's strike was Moscow, and actions on the flanks of the Kiev salient were merely a diversion. Even when intelligence data about Guderian's tanks turning south reached the Stavka, they refused to believe in the reality of what was happening. Commander of the Southwestern Front, Colonel General Kirponos, however, saw the situation differently. On August 27, he sent an alarming report to Moscow. The enemy, with up to 5 tank divisions, has broken through the defenses in the Novgorod-Seversky area. There is a real threat of a deep encirclement of the front's left flank. The Stavka's response was laconic. Hold Kiev at all costs. No talk of retreat. Guderian's tank divisions advanced at an incredible speed, up to 50 kilometers per day. On August 29, they crossed the Desna and continued moving southeast. Soviet troops, exhausted by previous battles, could not organize a continuous line of defense. Isolated pockets of resistance were quickly suppressed by concentrated strikes from German aviation and artillery. On September 7, advanced units of the SS Viking Division from Kleist's group and a tank division from Guderian's group met near Lukvitsa. The the encirclement ring closed. Inside it were 5 Soviet armies, the 5th, 26th, 37th, 21st, and 38th, totaling more than 600,000 men. The Kyiv Cauldron became a reality. On September 15, 1941, the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers was sealed. On this day, the advance units of Guderian's tank group captured Romny, while Kleist's tanks entered Lubny. The distance between the two German wedges narrowed to some 100 kilometers. Now, even the Stavka of the Supreme High Command began to realize the scale of the impending catastrophe. But it was already too late. On September 17th, Stalin finally gave permission to withdraw troops from the Kyiv salient. But by this time, German tank divisions had advanced even further east. The escape routes for the main forces of the Southwestern Front were cut off. On September 19th, a historic meeting took place in the Lovitsia area. The advance units of the 16th Tank Division of Kleist's group linked up with the 3rd Tank Division of Guderian's group. The encirclement ring finally closed. Inside the giant cauldron were 5 Soviet armies, totaling over 600,000 men. This was the largest encirclement in military history. The commander of the Southwestern Front, Colonel General Kirponos, made a desperate attempt to organize a breakthrough. On September 20, he gathered the last meeting of the front's military council in the village of Horodisha. It was decided to break through to the east in several columns. However, by this time, the troops were demoralized. There was a shortage of fuel, ammunition, and food. Communication between armies and divisions was practically non-existent. Many units acted disjointedly, without a unified plan. The German command, anticipating breakthrough attempts, created several concentric lines of defense. The outer ring consisted of mobile tank and motorized units, the inner ring of infantry divisions. The Luftwaffe continuously bombed concentrations of Soviet troops, destroying the last remnants of heavy equipment and artillery. On the night of September 21, Kirponos, with a group of staff officers, attempted to break out of the encirclement. But in the area of the Shumakovo tract, the front headquarters column encountered German tanks. In the ensuing battle, the commander was mortally wounded. Along with him, the front's chief of staff, Major General Tupakov, and the member of the Military Council of the Front, Divisional Commissar Burmastenko, died. The loss of leadership finally undermined organized resistance. Individual groups continued to fight, but their actions could no longer change the overall picture. By September 26th, resistance in the Cauldron was practically suppressed. The German command announced the capture of 665,000 Soviet soldiers and officers. 3,718 guns and 884 tanks were captured. This was a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. When the encirclement ring closed, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped inside. The situation within the Cauldron rapidly deteriorated. Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, attempted to organize a defense and coordinate the actions of the encircled armies. But with each passing hour, this became more difficult. Communication between units was disrupted, and troop command was practically paralyzed. The air was filled with a cacophony of desperate radio messages, many of which went unanswered. The first attempts at a breakthrough began almost immediately after the ring closed. General Kuznetsov's 21st Army tried to break through to the northeast in the direction of Roman, but was stopped by concentrated fire from German artillery and aviation. The 37th Army made a desperate attempt to break through to the south, but encountered the tank barriers of the SS Viking Division. On September 20th, Kirponos convened the last meeting of the front's military council in the village of Gorodishche. In a semi-ruined village school, by the light of kerosene lamps, the fate of hundreds of thousands of people was being decided. The decision was made to break through to the east in several columns. Kirponos understood that the chances of success were minimal. but there was no other option. On the night of September 21st, the front headquarters column, led by Kirponos, moved towards the Shumakovo tract. With the general were the front's chief of staff Tupakov, member of the military council Bermashtenko, and about 30 staff officers. Advancing along forest roads, the column unexpectedly encountered a German tank patrol. An unequal battle ensued. Kirponos personally led the defense, trying to organize the retreat of the main group. In this battle, he was mortally wounded by a mine fragment. Tupakov and Bermashtenko died with him. Effectively, the entire leadership of the front. The death of the command finally disorganized the resistance of the encircled troops. Individual units continued to fight, but without a unified plan or coordination. Some small groups still managed to infiltrate through the German barriers. Major General Pyotr Vershigora, commander of the 59th Rifle Division, later recalled, "We only moved at night, hiding in forests and swamps during the day. For food, only what we could find in abandoned villages or get from local residents." Inside the Cauldron, supplies of ammunition, food, and medicine quickly dwindled. The wounded died without proper care. Many units were completely cut off from water sources. German aviation continuously bombed concentrations of Soviet troops, preventing them from organizing a defense or preparing a breakthrough. By September 26th, organized resistance in the Cauldron had practically ceased. Isolated pockets continued to hold out for a few more days, but their fate was sealed. The German command announced the capture of 665,000 Soviet soldiers and officers, a figure that still causes debate among historians, but in any case reflects the scale of the catastrophe. By the end of September 1941, the Kyiv pocket had transformed into a vast field of human tragedy. Individual groups of Soviet soldiers still attempted to break out of the encirclement, but with each passing day, their numbers dwindled. German troops methodically tightened the ring, dividing the surrounded grouping into increasingly smaller parts. On September 26th, the command of Army Group South officially announced the completion of the operation to liquidate the pocket. According to German data, 665,000 Soviet servicemen were taken prisoner, a figure that shocked even seasoned German generals. In addition, the Wehrmacht captured 3,700 artillery pieces, 884 tanks, and thousands of other military equipment. The Red Army's losses in the Kyiv defensive operation were catastrophic. 5 armies of the Southwestern Front effectively ceased to exist. Dozens of experienced commanders were lost, including Front Commander Colonel General Kirponos. For many prisoners, a long and agonizing journey to German concentration camps began. Columns of disarmed, exhausted people were driven westward under escort. Many died from wounds, diseases, and exhaustion even en route. Only small groups managed to avoid captivity. Among those who managed to break out of the encirclement were future famous partisan commanders Sidor Kovpak and Alexander Saburov. They led out several hundred fighters, who later formed the nucleus of partisan formations. The fate of most prisoners proved tragic. According to post-war studies, less than 20% of Soviet prisoners of war captured in the Kyiv pocket survived until the end of the war. The rest died from hunger, disease, unbearable labor, or were destroyed in death camps. The Kyiv catastrophe had far-reaching consequences for the entire course of the war. The Soviet Union lost a significant portion of its armed forces at a critical moment, when German troops were preparing for a decisive thrust towards Moscow. The road to the Soviet capital appeared practically open. However, the operation to encircle the Kyiv grouping itself took almost a month, which gave the Soviet command valuable time to strengthen defenses in the Moscow direction. Hitler triumphed, believing that the destruction of such a huge enemy grouping brought victory in the war closer. He declared, "After this battle, the Russians will no longer be able to restore their strength." History proved this statement wrong. The Kyiv catastrophe opened a direct path to Moscow for German troops. After the annihilation of the largest grouping of Soviet forces in the south, the Wehrmacht gained strategic freedom of action that one could only dream of. The defense of the capital was critically weakened. In fact, between the tank divisions of Army Group Center and Moscow, there were no major combat-ready Red Army units left. Hitler triumphed. At a meeting at his headquarters on September 30th, he declared, "Russia is practically defeated. Now nothing will prevent us from taking Moscow before winter sets in." However, his joy was premature. The operation to encircle the Kyiv grouping, for all its success, also had a flip side. It delayed the advance on the Moscow direction by almost a month. This month became an invaluable gift for the Soviet command. During this time, the Stavka managed to transfer fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East to Moscow, create new lines of defense, and evacuate vital industrial enterprises. When German troops resumed their offensive on the capital in early October as part of Operation Typhoon, they encountered much more organized resistance than expected. Weather conditions also began to play against the Wehrmacht. The autumn mud turned roads into impassable streams of mud. Tanks and vehicles literally drowned in the mud. Supplying forward units became a real problem. Nevertheless, the position of Soviet troops remained critical. The loss of 650,000 experienced soldiers near Kyiv created a huge gap in the defense, which could not be fully closed by unseasoned recruits. Many divisions defending Moscow were only 50 to 60% staffed. There was a shortage of tanks, artillery, and ammunition. The lack of experienced mid-level commanders was particularly acute, precisely those who died or were captured in the Kyiv Cauldron. General Zhukov, appointed commander of the Western Front at the most critical moment, recalled, "We literally gathered forces for the defense of the capital, bit by bit. Every battalion, every company was accounted for." The German offensive on Moscow, which began on October 2nd, developed rapidly. By mid-month, significant forces of the Red Army near Vyazma and Bryansk were encircled. It seemed that the Kiev tragedy was repeating itself. However, this time the Soviet command learned from previous mistakes. Many units managed to break out of the encirclement, and most importantly, a new line of defense was organized. By early November, the German offensive ran out of steam 30 kilometers from Moscow. The Wehrmacht's forces were exhausted, and Soviet troops received reinforcements. The Kyiv catastrophe, for all its tragedy, gave the Red Army invaluable experience and time to prepare the capital's defense. What if Hitler had continued the offensive on Moscow instead of turning towards Kyiv? This question still sparks heated debates among historians and military analysts. Alternative scenarios of events allow for a better understanding of the significance of decisions made and their impact on the course of the war. If, in August of '41, German tank divisions had not turned south but had continued their movement towards the Soviet capital, history could have taken a completely different path. By mid-August, Army Group Center was approximately 300 kilometers from Moscow. Guderian's and Hoth's tank formations were battered in previous battles, but maintained high combat effectiveness. Had the pace of the offensive been maintained, and all efforts concentrated on the Moscow direction, German troops could have reached the outskirts of the capital by mid-September, before the autumn muddy season began. Soviet defenses in this direction were weakened after heavy fighting near Smolensk. Reserves had not yet been brought up in sufficient numbers. The system of fortifications around Moscow was under construction. The capture of Moscow in September seemed a quite realistic prospect. However, would the capture of the capital have meant the capitulation of the Soviet Union? Historical experience shows that the taking of a capital does not always lead to the end of a war. In 1812, Napoleon captured Moscow, but this did not bring him victory. Stalin would likely have continued resistance, relocating the Stavka to Kuibyshev or Sverdlovsk. The industry of the Urals and Siberia would have allowed for the continued production of armaments. Nevertheless, the psychological effect of Moscow's fall would have been enormous. The prestige of the Soviet leadership would have been severely damaged. Perhaps disagreements would have arisen among the high command regarding future strategy. The Allies might have doubted the USSR's ability to continue the war. On the other hand, even without the Kyiv operation, the Germans would still have faced the problem of stretched communications and a shortage of resources for conducting a winter campaign. The Soviet Union would have retained significant forces in the south, which would have threatened the flank and rear of the advancing group. Hitler's decision to turn towards Kyiv, for all its controversy, had its own logic. The destruction of a large enemy grouping and the capture of resource-rich territories corresponded to his ideas about warfare. However, the strategic pause caused by the Kyiv operation gave the Soviet command invaluable time to prepare Moscow's defense. Ultimately, history knows no subjunctive mood. We can only analyze the decisions made and their consequences, drawing lessons for the future. The Kyiv operation became a true laboratory of military art, providing numerous lessons for future generations of strategists. Analyzing the events of the autumn of '41, military theorists highlight several key factors that determined the outcome of the battle. The first and perhaps most important lesson concerns the role of mobility in modern warfare. German tank wedges, rapidly covering vast distances, demonstrated the superiority of maneuver warfare over positional defense. Guderian's and Kleist's tank groups acted like giant scissors, cutting off retreat routes for entire armies. Moreover, the speed of advance was more important than firepower. German tanks often avoided protracted battles, striving to reach operational space as quickly as possible. The second lesson is related to the critical importance of intelligence and information analysis. The Soviet command had data on the movements of German tank formations, but failed to interpret them correctly. Stalin and the general staff refused to believe until the last moment that Hitler had postponed the offensive on Moscow. This error in assessing the enemy's intentions cost hundreds of thousands of soldiers their lives. The third lesson is the importance of reliable communication in troop command. When the encirclement ring closed, Soviet armies quickly lost coordination of actions. The lack of stable communication between headquarters and formations turned organized resistance into scattered pockets of defense. German troops, equipped with modern radio stations, maintained control even with rapid advance. The fourth lesson concerns the relationship between political and military strategic decisions. Stalin's order to hold Kyiv at all costs had political motives, but contradicted military expediency. When political considerations dominate military logic, the result is often a catastrophe. The fifth lesson is the importance of timely withdrawal of troops from threatened areas. The Soviet command missed several opportunities for an organized retreat. When the decision was finally made, it was too late. The sixth lesson is related to the psychological factor in decision-making. Hitler, carried away by the idea of destroying the enemy's manpower, missed the strategic goal, Moscow. Stalin, unwilling to admit the reality of the encirclement threat, doomed hundreds of thousands of people to death and captivity. The personal ambitions and prejudices of leaders had a fatal impact on the course of events. The seventh lesson concerns the importance of reserves in modern warfare. After the Kyiv catastrophe, the Soviet command drew conclusions and began to create large strategic reserves, which subsequently played a decisive role in the defense of Moscow and the counteroffensive. The eighth lesson is the importance of flexibility and strategic planning. The German command demonstrated the ability to quickly redirect efforts from one direction to another, which allowed them to achieve tactical success. However, strategically, this flexibility resulted in a dispersal of forces and a loss of momentum in the main direction. The Kyiv operation clearly showed that in modern warfare, victory is determined not only by numerical superiority, but also by the quality of command, the speed of decision-making, the mobility of troops, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. These lessons were learned by the Soviet command at the cost of enormous sacrifices and taken into account in subsequent battles of the Great Patriotic War. The Kyiv Cauldron remains one of the most tragic and instructive pages of World War II. 80 years later, historians from different countries continue to analyze the causes and consequences of this catastrophe, trying to learn lessons from the past. In Soviet historiography, for a long time, events near Kyiv were covered sparingly and one-sidedly. The official version placed all responsibility on the perfidy of the enemy, remaining silent about the fatal mistakes of its own leadership. Only in the 90s, with the opening of archives, did a more objective assessment of what happened become possible. In Western historical science, the Kyiv operation is considered an example of brilliant operational art of the Wehrmacht, but at the same time, a strategic miscalculation by Hitler, which diverted forces from the decisive strike on Moscow. In the collective memory of nations, the Kyiv Cauldron occupies a special place. For Ukrainians, it is not only a military tragedy, but also a symbol of the suffering that befell their land. For Russians, a reminder of the terrible price paid for the miscalculations of the leadership. For Germans, evidence of the illusory nature of easy victories and a harbinger of future defeat. The influence of the Kyiv catastrophe on the subsequent course of the war cannot be overestimated. On the one hand, the loss of more than 600,000 experienced fighters critically weakened Soviet defenses at a crucial moment. On the other hand, the delay of the German offensive on Moscow for almost a month gave invaluable time to prepare the defense of the capital. Stalin and his entourage learned bitter lessons from the Kyiv tragedy. Subsequent decisions of the Soviet command became more balanced, and a readiness to withdraw troops from threatened areas in a timely manner appeared. The creation of strategic reserves became a priority. The Kyiv Cauldron forever changed perceptions of the scale of possible military operations. Until then, military theorists could not imagine the encirclement and capture of an army numbering more than 500,000 people. Today, this operation is studied in all military academies of the world as an example of the complex interaction of political ambitions, strategic miscalculations, and tactical skill. Ultimately, the Kyiv catastrophe became one of the turning points of the war, not in terms of the transfer of strategic initiative, but as a point after which it became clear the Blitzkrieg had failed, and a long and grueling struggle lay ahead. For Hitler, the victory near Kyiv turned out to be a Pyrrhic one. By destroying a large grouping of Soviet troops, he missed the opportunity to inflict a decisive blow on Moscow before winter set in. The time spent on the Kyiv operation became the resource that allowed the Soviet Union to withstand the most critical period of the war.